In the dark, pounding midnight storm over Cameroon, a Boeing 737 is climbing through the storm clouds. From the first breath of climb, the plane tendency to drift to the right begins. The captain manually corrects it back to level. After 42 seconds of climb, the captain calls for the autopilot to be engaged. The first officer gives no response, and the autopilot remains disengaged. As the climb continues, the steady roll to the right is gradually increasing, and yet neither pilot recognizes the gravity of what is unfolding. When the bank angle warning pierces through the cockpit, panic takes hold. In his desperate attempt to correct the situation, the captain only makes the situation worse. This is the shutdown sequence of Kenya Airways Flight 507. On the dusk hours of May 4, 2007, Port Boué Airport in Côte d'Ivoire was buzzed and bristled with departing flights. Among them was Kenya Airways Flight 507, bound for Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi, Kenya. The aircraft involved in this incident was a Boeing 737-800, proudly operated by Kenya Airways. Registered as 5YKYA, this plane first took to the skies in October 2006 and was delivered to the airline later that same month. At just over 6 months old, it was one of the newest in the fleet. Powered by 2 turbofan engines, the jet was configured with 16 business class and 129 economy seats, 145 passengers in total capacity. In command of the flight deck were 2 Kenyan pilots. On the left seat was Captain Francis Wamwea, a 52-year-old veteran of the skies. He held a Kenyan Commercial Pilot License, CPL, obtained on the 10th of April 1991, and a valid Kenyan Air Transport Pilot License, ATPL, license number YK-1949-AL. His Class 1 medical certificate was valid until the 4th of November 2007, confirming his fitness for commercial airline operations. In total, he had logged an impressive 8,682 flight hours, of which 3,464 hours were as pilot in command. Beside the captain sat the pilot monitoring, Andrew Kiuru, just 23 years old. A newly minted first officer, Andrew had joined Kenya Airways barely a year prior. With only 800 hours of total flight time, he had trained extensively in South Africa, earning his wings in 2006, making him the least experienced member in the cockpit. The aircraft takes at exactly 6:45 p.m. On board 55 passengers, of which 38 are to disembark at Douala. No incidents are reported during this first leg of the journey. 3 hours and 16 minutes later, it lands safely at Douala International Airport at 10:01 p.m. Flight 507 was a scheduled international service connecting Ivory Coast to Kenya with an intermediate stop in Cameroon. For the first segment, the airplane took off at 6:45 p.m. local time from Abidjan to Douala, a short hop crossing the Gulf of Guinea, flying eastward over coastal waters before entering Cameroonian airspace, and lands in Douala International Airport at 10:01 p.m. The second leg of the journey was scheduled shortly before midnight, flying across Cameroon, pass over the Central African Republic, cross the vast Democratic Republic of Congo, continue above Uganda, and finally enter Kenya's capital. This flight was expected to take about 4.5 hours, arriving in Nairobi in early morning. After landing, Flight 507 taxis towards stand C7 on the instructions of the control tower. The pilot positions the plane at stand C7 without assistance and shuts down the engines. Passengers disembark 20 minutes after engines shut down due to slight delay by Kenya Airways ground crew to have the plane towed and properly parked. Nearby, thunderstorms rolled over the airport, a common occurrence at night in Central Africa, where convectional rainfall is common. The preparation for the second leg of the flight begins after a short while. An employee of the ground handling company signs out the meteorological protection file prepared by the Douala Principal Meteorological Center and hands it to Kenya Airways ground crew office, which in turn transmits it to the crew on board the plane. The Kenya Airways engineer accompanying the flight supervises the refueling of the plane. 9,500 kilograms of fuel are pumped in, bringing the total quantity of fuel on board to 14,200 kilograms. The ground crew proceeds to embark 91 passengers to join the 17 who were on board for the flight to Nairobi, which along with the 6 crew members brought the number of people on board to 114. At 10:33 p.m. Flight 507 makes first contact with the air traffic controller on duty at the tower. By the scheduled departure time of 11 p.m, the plane was not ready, and the delays would only continue to mount. Despite having obtained a takeoff clearance from the ATC. At 11:37, already well behind schedule, the captain cancelled his startup clearance to wait for a lull in the rainfall as the conditions were unsuitable for takeoff. The passengers and crew would spend another 20 minutes sitting on the apron. At 11:54 p.m, the crew again request a new authorization to start up, and at 11:05 KQ 507 is cleared to taxi and backtrack for runway 12. 2 minutes later, having completed routine checks and secured the cabin, the crew lined up with the runway for takeoff. Although it was first officer's mandate as the monitoring pilot to work the radios, the captain took it upon himself to request a weather diversion from air traffic control. Flight 507 thunders down the runway smoothly, and at 12:06 a.m. it takes off at runway 12 without any trouble. Neither pilot noticed that they had just taken off without clearance from air traffic control. It was a bizarre mistake that would turn out to have nothing to do with the fate which followed. As soon as the airplane is airborne, it had a net tendency to roll to the right. The pilot reacts immediately. He inputs a 30-degree of left roll on the control wheel and then turns the wheel back to the neutral position and continues to modulate left control wheel to maintain wings level. The bank angle of the airplane stays within the limit of 3 degrees right. Just like cars, airplanes often have a natural tendency to pull to one side, and this one was no exception. The cause of the right roll would later be put down to inherent asymmetry in the construction of the wings, along with a very slight right rudder trim setting left over due to play in the rudder trim system. The captain continues to make inputs on the flight controls between 500 and 1,000 feet. The tendency of the airplane to roll to the right is controlled, and bank angle remains at less than 1 degree. During the same period, several inputs on the pitch trim for nose-up attitude are also apparent. The crew focused on their plan to divert around the thunderstorms near the airport. At 12:06:41 a.m., the captain calls OK Command. This was an order to engage the autopilot in command mode, the primary mode in which the autopilot has full authority to control the airplane. Pressing the autopilot command mode button on the autopilot panel would engage command mode and cause the autopilot to fly the plane on the already selected heading. The first officer does not respond, nor did he ever press the autopilot command mode button. The procedure for engaging the autopilot as inscribed in the Standard Operation Procedures Amplified (SOPA) is less precise than that prescribed by Boeing in its B737 OPS manual. It leaves room to diverse interpretations by flight crew as to when the autopilot can be engaged. This was confirmed in interviews with company's Boeing 737 flight instructors. Besides that, the procedure in use at that moment recommends that the pilot flying do the engaging and that the pilot monitoring confirm the flight mode annunciator indication. Plane kept turning by itself, rolling slowly to the right as it had been ever since takeoff. Passing 1,000 feet climbing, all action on the flight controls ceases. The airplane goes into a continuous roll to the right, passing 34 degrees of bank angle. Control inputs resumed at 2,700 feet and 34 degrees of right bank when, suddenly the pilot in command noticed that they were banking steeply to the right, causing him to make erratic inputs. Less than 1 second later, the plane rolled through 35 degrees of bank angle, triggering a loud alarm. He immediately grabbed his control column and instinctively wrenched it to the right, then back to the left, then hard to the right again. The plane rapidly rolled to the right, approaching 50 degrees of bank, way beyond the normal flight envelope. Only now that the pilot in command noticed that the autopilot was not engaged. He reached up and pressed the CMD button, hoping to engage it in command mode. But due to the pressure on the captain's control column, it engaged in control wheel steering mode instead. In this mode, the autopilot simply holds whatever roll and pitch attitude the pilot applies using the control column. When engaged at bank angles beyond the standard limit, the autopilot in control wheel steering mode will slowly roll the plane back to a safe 30 degrees of bank, but no farther. When the autopilot is engaged using autopilot command mode, the airplane responds to the pre-selected modes. And when the autopilot is engaged using the control wheel steering mode, if pressure on the flight controls is removed with a bank angle of less than 6 degrees, the autopilot rolls back the wings to the horizontal position and maintains the existing heading. When the autopilot is engaged using the autopilot command mode, strong pressure on the flight controls on throttle or pitch axis will engage either the partial roll or pitch mode of the control wheel steering, and the corresponding indications will appear on the flight mode annunciator. When the autopilot did not immediately level the wings, the pilot in command became frustrated and grabbed the control column again, overpowering the autopilot. Swinging the control column back and forth while mashing the rudder, he sent the plane rolling to the right again. The bank angle reaches 90 degrees to the right and is increasing further. The pitch decreases suddenly and the airplane enters into a spiral dive. The pilot monitoring tells the captain to level the wings by the right, then quickly corrects himself and says with insistence, "Left, left, left, captain." At 12:08 a.m., Kenya Airways Flight 507 pitched steeply downward and upside down, slammed into a mangrove swamp deep in the estuary of the Woori River. Traveling at 530 kilometers per hour, the 737 gouged a massive crater in the swamp, sending mangled debris, chunks of mud, and pieces of trees billowing out over a vast area. Much of the wreckage penetrated up to 5 meters into the waterlogged ground. For the 114 passengers and crew, there was no hope. All died instantly on impact. No distress message was received from the crew. The emergency locator beacon did not emit any exploitable signal as it was damaged on impact. Even though the plane had crashed just a few kilometers outside Douala, it remained unnoticed until the plane failed to arrive in Nairobi 5 hours later. A major air and ground search was launched in the region, but nothing was found. It took over 20 hours before authorities discovered that the plane had barely even made it out of the city. It crashed in the swamp about 5 kilometers southeast of the airport. Nearby villagers had apparently known about the crash for some time, but due to a lack of communication, this information didn't come out until the search was already well underway. The reaction of the captain indicates a case of spatial disorientation resulting from a long, slow turn without monitoring of the electronic attitude director indicator, EADI, with no exterior visual reference in a dark night, transitioning to a case of recognized spatial disorientation as the airplane's right bank angle increased beyond 35 degrees. The consequences of the disorientation are further aggravated by poor repartition of tasks on board and non-application of the recovery procedure as stated in the company QRH, approved by KCAA. The procedures call for the following: recognize and confirm the situation, disconnect autopilot and auto throttle, roll in shortest direction to wings level, recover to level flight, apply nose-up elevator, apply nose-up trim if required, and adjust thrust and drag as required. The pilot monitoring is supposed to call out any deviations and any omissions throughout the recovery. The NTSB determined that the cause of the tragedy was as a result of spatial disorientation after a long, slow roll, during which no instrument scanning was done, and in the absence of external visual references in a dark night. Inadequate operational control, lack of crew coordination, coupled with the non-adherence to procedures of flight monitoring, confusion in the utilization of the autopilot, escalated the situation. The circumstances surrounding this flight suggest reasons for failure to recover from the upset would be either lack of training or lack of situational awareness due to spatial disorientation. The findings also shows that the captain had been sanctioned and underwent a line retraining and proficiency check 3 years earlier. The check had been ordered because of the captain's decision to initiate a diversion due to a standby ADI failure during a scheduled passenger flight. Management had considered that the diversion demonstrated a lack of understanding following failure of airplane systems and the redundancies that are designed into the system. Since successfully checking out as captain on B737, KQA instructors and examiners had written several reports about him, making mention of several recurrent shortcomings, notably concerning crew resource management, knowledge of systems, respect of SOP, cockpit scan and situation awareness, planning and decision-making. The medical records of the two pilots reveal some ocular problems. The captain suffers of low vision acuity due to myopia, necessitating the constant wearing of corrective lenses. The first officer had diminishing visual acuity, necessitating the permanent wearing of corrective lenses. DNA testing was carried out by the International Commission on Missing Person DNA Laboratory in Sarajevo, Bosnia. Out of the 114 souls, only 86 victims were positively identified by DNA, with 4 victims identified by fingerprints. As we remember Flight 507, we honor those who were lost. Their memory continues to remind us why safety, training, and vigilance in aviation matter so deeply.